The hidden meaning of House of Dragon credits. Dragons, castles, and family power struggle like no other. House of the Dragon is everything you need for a binge marathon. Even after the disappointing finale of its predecessor, House of the Dragon is promised to make up for all the loose ends that Game of Thrones left untied. Within the span of just 3 episodes, House of Dragon has become one of the biggest shows in the world right now, and for good reason. But as we move further into the world of the Targaryen household, new secrets unravel, completely changing what we knew Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms to be. So how is House of the Dragon making use of symbolism in its storytelling? And what is the hidden meaning behind the show's credits? Let's find out. Throwing it back. When the first episode of House of the Dragon aired, the fans were a little disappointed to see that the show did not feature an iconic opening song like its predecessor. If there's one thing that Game of Thrones was known for, it was the catchy and dramatic opening sequence that took us through a map of Westeros, sort of acting like an explainer for the world that the show was set in. But here's a fun fact. The showrunners actually went ahead and wrapped things up on the pilot before they realized that the story was kind of all over the place. With such a massive kingdom and so many families fighting for the Iron Throne, the fans needed a map to orient themselves in all the locations where the story was taking place. Now, if you've read the books, you would know that George R.R. Martin would always have a map right in the beginning. The fans could keep returning to this map to see where exactly the story was taking place. And so the opening credits of the main show worked the same way as the map. But what most people failed to notice was that the theme song of Game of Thrones changed with every single episode. That's right. With every episode, the map would show locations relevant to the story with additional elements for the fans to go back to. So, for example, in the episode where Winterfell burned, the map showed smoke rising from the location on the map. Similarly, whenever a house conquers a castle, its sigil shows up on it. Small Easter eggs like these were what made the show so special. After all, it's all in the details, isn't it? The legacy continues. Now, with the Game of Thrones opening credits setting so many standards, the fans expected nothing less from the prequel. After a thrilling first episode that completely changed all we know about Westeros, the fans were led to believe that this show will feature an opening sequence. However, with the second episode, the world was taken back to Game of Thrones with the title sequence of House of the Dragon making its debut to the same tune. This way, the showrunners triggered a sense of nostalgia within the fans, and even the ones who decided to skip the prequel after the wreck that was the Game of Thrones finale can't help but be transported back to Westeros when the familiar tune starts to play. However, there is a stark, no pun intended, difference between the two sequences. Like we just talked about, the Game of Thrones title sequence was a map to Westeros that changed a bit depending on the story of each episode. However, by the looks of it, in the title sequence for the prequel, we will only see major changes in the map when the Targaryen family itself goes through some major change, such as a birth, a death, or a marriage. So while the map of Game of Thrones was essentially a map of the kingdom, the one in House of the Dragon is the key to understanding how complex and widespread the Targaryen clan is. The flow of the blood. The House of the Dragon opening credits shows us the Targaryen family tree along with all the buildings and important sites in Old Valyria. However, when the fans notice right from the start is that there's a stream of blood that flows through the family tree. As we move from one Targaryen faction to the next, the blood keeps filling in all the gaps, maybe symbolizing how the Dance of the Dragons is going to wipe out generations of the family in the biggest civil war that Westeros will perhaps ever see. So, if you notice in the third episode, Queen Aemma Arryn's gear is filled with blood because the Queen passes away in the very first episode. But Viserys' gear is still intact, which shows that the kind is not going anywhere anytime soon. Of course, as we move toward the Dance of the Dragons, more and more names will start disappearing under this flow of blood, and who knows, by the end of the series, the entire family tree might just end up being a big pool of blood with small gaps to show the survivors and successors of the Iron Throne. The Dragon Family Tree. The show's opening credits begin in Olly Valyria as we see Aegon the Conqueror's insignia to symbolize how the ruler conquered Westeros. His blood then flows down to his 2 wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, and that's when we start following Rhaenys' bloodline, showing that the story of the House of the Dragon essentially starts with her. We then see her son King Aenys I Targaryen, his son King Jaehaerys I Targaryen, who has overline gears extending from him and his wife Alysanne's gears. We then have Balon and Alyssa, whose son Viserys rules the throne as the show begins. And well, you know how the blood flows from there. So for anyone who's having trouble figuring out which Targaryen is which, maybe a closer look at the title sequence will clear up your confusion. The blood then flows from Viserys to his brother Daemon, and then Rhaenyra Targaryen, who is named heir to the throne in the pilot episode. However, we then have Viserys' gear shifting in another direction as he marries Alicent Hightower, who gives birth to tons of children, including sons who hope to take over the kingdom after their father. However, since Rhaenyra has already been named heir to the throne, we see the opening credits end with her spinning gear and insignia, symbolizing that she is going to be at the heart of this story. The converging storylines. For those of you who don't know, House of the Dragon is based on George R.R. Martin's novel Fire and Blood and tells us the story of the Targaryen Empire and how it became what it was in the first season of Game of Thrones. The show is set in the time of King Viserys Targaryen and gives us a look at the intense power struggle that went on in the family of the dragons as Viserys is caught between his firstborn, Princess Rhaenyra, and his brother, Prince Daemon, and the entire House of Targaryen goes at each other to rule the Iron Throne. However, the show's opening sequence fails to show plenty of members of the Targaryen clan who are essential to the story. For example, one of these characters is King Maegor Targaryen, who went on to rule the kingdom after Aegon the Conqueror passed away. But since Maegor left no heirs, it makes sense why his character is skipped from the story. Several other Targaryens have also failed to make the cut, but with a new revelation making its way to us with every single episode of the show, it's still pretty soon to say which characters are going to be part of the show and which aren't. However, one thing is for sure, the show's opening credits do touch upon the fact that we are still in Westeros, and while the Targaryens might be the overruling majority here, the other houses also do have a say. As soon as the prequel was announced, the fans knew that this show would primarily be telling us the origin story of House Targaryen and how they lost the glory that they once had. But in all that chaos, the other houses also played a pretty huge part, right? After all, the very core of Westeros is familial power struggles that make the whole thing all the more fun to indulge in. For now, what we know is that the House of Stark and Lannister is probably not going to be part of the show because of the timeline difference. At the same time, Houses Hightower, Velaryon, and Strong are also going to be central to the story despite having gone extinct by the time we enter the Game of Thrones. Of course, the Hightowers are heavily involved with the Targaryens, with Otto Hightower being the king's hand, but with the tensions between Otto and Daemon soaring high, there is potential for a lot of brand new conflict in the show. But still, the Hightowers and Velaryons briefly make it into the opening title, and well, because the Targaryen family members married into these two houses, it makes sense for their gears to be connected with the ruling family. Dance of the Dragons. Of course, with such a detailed title sequence, it would be a shame for the showrunners not to mention the infamous Dance of the Dragons, the civil war to end all civil wars. From all we know of the show right now, we know that the primary theme of the story is succession. Who gets to take over the throne, and what will they do to make sure that they retain their rule? That's what the show is all about. With Rhaenyra, Prince Daemon, and Viserys' offsprings from her second marriage, all ready to claim their rightful place as the rulers of Westeros, a grand power struggle within the family as we see who finally gets to rule the Seven Kingdoms. Dance of the Dragons is an all-out civil war that breaks out within the multiple factions of the Targaryen clan, as all of them battle it out to earn their place as the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. This clash is what ensues in the Dance of the Dragons, where bloodlines upon bloodlines of the Targaryens are wiped out, their dragons killed, and their kingdom destroyed. But who wins this brutal civil war? If you pay attention to the opening sequence, you'll be able to see that some of the major events in the history of Westeros are depicted through the map. First of all, we see the Doom of Valyria that appears when Aegon's gear is on the screen. For those of you who don't know, the Doom of Valyria was a destructive event in the history of Westeros that completely destroyed the city and the area that surrounded it, killing everyone, not even sparing any dragons. The Doom was caused by the eruption of 14 volcanoes in the region, which is where the dragons came from. However, legend also says that blood magic is what caused this deadly event. What's the true story? We can only wait and watch patiently for our questions to be answered. And as the king's blood flows down, we see soldiers fighting one another, depicting the war in Westeros that Aegon wins to conquer the kingdom. And as we move down to Rhaenyra's bloodline, we see two dragons fighting surrounded by the sigils of houses that include the Lannisters, Baratheons, Starks, Frys, Dustins, and Hightowers. However, the map also indicates that this fight will only take place once Rhaenyra comes to power. Now, whether that's going to be as the queen or as a rebel, we have to wait and find out. Since we already know that the Game of Thrones timeline is directly connected to Rhaenyra's life and relationships, is the deadly Dance of the Dragons. And that's all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel to focus for more related news. Until next time, we'll see you. Goodbye.